All right, I think we still have lots of people who are joining, but I think we're going to go ahead and get started to make sure that we give everyone an opportunity um, to hear this excellent presentation. I don't want us to run over and not have a chance for folks to ask questions. So good afternoon to everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Renee Fry. I'm the Executive Director of Open Sky Policy Institute. And welcome to our webinar on the national, state, and local economic impact of the pandemic. We're so fortunate to have three experts with us today. We have Dr. Matthew Fiedler, Dr. Matthew Fiedler, who will be talking about the national economy, followed by Dr. Eric Thompson, who will share his forecast of the state economy, and Brandon Kaufman will share the impact of the pandemic on Lincoln's economy. And each of our experts will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Open Sky Policy Institute, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit focused on budget, tax, and education finance. And I want to quickly recognize the Open Sky staff that helped pull this webinar together. Chuck Brown is our communications director, Tony Roberts, our operations manager, Craig Beck, our fiscal analyst, and Alex Surrey, our White's fellow. Also on today is Connie Kanoki, who's our education policy director. We also have a board member and some of our advisors who are joining us today that I want to recognize. Lizette Aliaga Linares, Tracy Bradley, Joaquin Fox, former Senator Paul Shoemaker, and Annette Smith. We're just very grateful to you for your support and your input. With the legislative session reconvening on July 20th, we thought that it would be a good opportunity for senators, many of whom are joining us today, and others to hear about the latest projections in preparation for session. A couple of themes you will hear about today are that Nebraska seems to be doing better than most of the country, but a lot of uncertainty lies ahead. We certainly are in uncharted territory, as this is no ordinary recession. And while none of us have a crystal ball, our hope is that the information you hear today can help the decisions you are making in the near term for the future, whether you're a state lawmaker or a local elected official or a school superintendent. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be available following the webinar. All PowerPoint presentations will also be made available. And attendees will be on mute for the entire duration of this webinar. I'm very sorry that we won't be able to see your faces, but we had 200 folks, over 200 sign up for today. So unfortunately, we lose some of that personal connection when it's such a large group. If you do have a question, be sure to type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time. And we've already received a number of questions in advance, but we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So we're going to go ahead and get started with Dr. Matthew Fiedler. Matt is a fellow with USC Brookings Schaefer Initiative for Health Policy. Prior to joining the Brookings Institution, Matt served as chief economist of the Council of Economic Advisors, where he oversaw the council's work on healthcare policy. So Matt, go ahead and get started.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. And let me just share my slides here and I will get started. Apologies. There we go. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I want to provide sort of a national perspective on both where the economy is and what that's likely to mean for state budgets in the coming months and likely years, as well as how the federal government has responded to the pressures that state budgets are facing and how it might respond in the future. So, you know, I think everyone here is sort of familiar with the three basic ways that the current economic situation, pandemic and economic situation is affecting state budgets. So states and localities are incurring a lot of direct COVID-19 costs, whether that be related to contact tracing or securing supplies for hospitals or you know, just sort of managing the broader public health response. And then there are there are two other ways, both of which reflect the ways the pandemic is affecting the macroeconomy that then has consequences for state budgets. So the pandemic and the responses to it have reduced incomes and consumption, which is translated into lower revenues for state and local governments. And reductions in incomes have also, and people losing health insurance that they had through their job, has led to increased demands on safety net programs, particularly the Medicaid program. So again, I'm going to focus on those second two components, and those second two components are fundamentally going to depend, both the revenue declines and the pressure on programs is going to depend on the macroeconomic outlook. So to provide a sense of sort of what the possible futures might look like, I'm showing you four prominent macroeconomic forecasts here. One is from the Congressional Budget Office, one from the economic research team at Goldman Sachs, and then I'm showing you the forecast by the most optimistic and most pessimistic participant in the Federal Reserve's June meetings. This isn't a sort of scientific sample of forecasts, but I think it gives you a sense of the range of forecasts coming from prominent forecasters. So there are three things I think that are worth noticing here. First, as everyone is obviously aware, we're in a very deep recession at the moment. May and April saw the highest unemployment rates since the Great Depression. Second, while all of the projections show recovery going forward, there's a very real possibility that recovery will take a long time. So if you look at three of the four forecasts here, basically the three forecasts except the forecast of the most optimistic Federal Reserve meeting participant, the unemployment rate is still above 6% even at the start of 2023. So even as we enter recovery, we may be in for a long haul. And then the third thing I would highlight is that there's a lot of disagreement about just how fast recovery will happen. And that reflects some very real underlying uncertainties. Our models of the macroeconomy are very far from perfect. And so there's just some inherent uncertainty in trying to predict the future. But we also don't know, in this case, how the public health situation is going to evolve. I think a lot of these forecasts implicitly assumed that we were past the peak and that while we would be dealing with COVID-19 for some time, the worst might be behind us. I think events over the last few weeks suggest that may not be right, and that there's, at least in certain parts of the country, risk of substantial additional outbreaks, and that translates into very significant uncertainty about the economic outlook. That's the case even if states and localities respond to renewed transmission differently than they did the first time around. A lot of the economic research we've gotten, early research on the economic effects of the pandemic that we've gotten, have indicated that while a portion of the decline in economic activity was about states and localities' decisions to curtail certain types of activities, a lot of the reduction in economic activity was about individuals' own efforts to protect themselves. So either not going out or changing how they were going about their daily activity. So how might that economic outlook translate into effects on state budgets? One simple place to look is history. So what I'm showing you here is the percent change, year-over-year change in real per capita state tax revenues against the percentage point change in the unemployment rate. And that, if you put a best fit line through this, you'd conclude that a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate translated to about a 3.7% reduction in tax revenues. I think there's reason to believe that history might be a little pessimistic this time around, at least in the near term. The federal fiscal policy response has been more aggressive than normal, which has buoyed incomes and consumption, and in turn will buoy tax revenues. But obviously those beneficial effects will only last as long as federal relief policies continue. There's also some reason to believe that the mix of people who have lost their jobs in this downturn have had somewhat lower incomes than normal, which would also tend to blunt the impact on tax revenues. And then we're just in uncharted territory, right? The largest unemployment rate increase I'm showing you here is a little more than 2 percentage points. The increase in unemployment we've seen over the last couple months is many times that large. And so exactly how the effect on revenues will scale as the economic shock scales, I think is something we don't exactly know. I think it's also important to keep in mind that this is a national rule of thumb. Different states are likely to be different depending on their mix of revenue sources. So, what goes for the nation may not precisely reflect what happens in the past. But with those caveats, a 3.7% reduction in revenues translates to about $41 billion in lost state revenues per point that the unemployment rate goes up. In some other work with colleagues, I've estimated that a percentage point of unemployment probably also puts around $4 billion in pressure on states through higher demands on Medicaid and other programs. So in total, we're talking about $45 billion in total pressure on state budgets due to per point that the unemployment rate. So if you take that rough rule of thumb and you apply it to the unemployment projections I was looking at earlier, you can get a forecast of how much pressure our state budget's going to be facing relative to what would have happened if unemployment had remained at its pre-crisis level. And I think there are three things to notice about these. So first is that across all the unemployment projections, the shortfalls states are going to be facing are quite large. Even in the most optimistic projection, we're talking about $350 billion in cumulative shortfalls through 2023. And the most pessimistic projection, the shortfalls exceed $1.1 trillion. The second thing to highlight is that the shortfalls are long lasting. In 3 of the 4 projections, even by fiscal 2023, you're still looking at shortfalls of about $100 billion on a national basis. And then the third thing to highlight is that there's a lot of uncertainty about how large these shortfalls will all ultimately be. We're looking at uncertainty of more than threefold from the least, from the most optimistic projection to the most pessimistic projection. So that's just a very, very wide range of possible outcomes. So, in the face of these state fiscal pressures, Congress has taken some steps to cushion the impact on state and local governments. I think, you can think about sort of 3 basic buckets. In the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the federal government increased the federal matching rate for Medicaid program by 6.2 percentage points. And that increase is going to last as long as the federally declared public health emergency remains in effect. That translates to about $40 billion a year. And I think it's plausible that funding will continue at least through the end of 2021. Though I think you can tell stories where it ends a little sooner or goes on for longer. I think that's sort of a reasonable guess. So that funding is relatively flexible. It obviously can offset increased Medicaid costs, but by allowing states to reduce the money they spend on their Medicaid programs, it may free up dollars that can be used to meet general revenue shortfalls. The second category of relief is much less flexible. So the largest bucket of money in this pot, this panel B in the table I'm showing you, is $150 billion coronavirus relief fund. In principle, those funds are only available to meet direct COVID-19 costs. And so they're not likely to be available to meet the sort of broader fiscal pressures I'm mainly talking about here. It's conceivable there's a little bit of wiggle room around that in practice if states get creative, states and localities get creative. But I think, in general, you should assume that those funds are not available to meet these broader fiscal pressures. And then the third category is a smattering of other pots of money that were included in the CARES Act. Some education money, transportation money, and various and sundry other types of funds. There's probably some flexibility here to use some of these funds to meet obligations that state and local governments otherwise would have had, bringing up dollars to meet these broader fiscal pressures, but certainly not all of these funds will be available. So the bottom line, if you sort of add up across the various rows of this table, I think it's hard to believe there's more than $200 billion or so that the federal government has already enacted that will be available to meet general fiscal pressures at the state level. And I think it's entirely possible that the amount of sort of flexible funding that's been provided to date is closer to $100 billion. So, if you take that $100 to $200 billion range and you compare it to the state budget shortfalls that we're likely looking at the national level over the next few years, that funding is just going to be well short, even under the fairly optimistic scenarios of the pressure that states are likely. So just before wrapping up, the 2 things I want to leave you with. I think states are almost certain to face large budget shortfalls over the next few years. Cumulatively, those are likely to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars and exceed the aid the federal government has enacted to date. And they may be quite long lasting. I think it may be at least fiscal 2023 before or beyond before states are really getting back to normal from a budget perspective. I think the other thing to emphasize is the magnitude of those shortfalls and the duration of those shortfalls remains really uncertain. And I think that has implications for both state and federal policymakers. So I think at the state level, state policymakers should be preparing for the possibility that the fiscal pressure is going to be larger and last longer than their current base case projection suggests. So they should be putting themselves in a position to the extent they can to cope with, if not the worst case scenario, then worst case scenarios than their best guess. At the federal level, if and when federal policymakers provide additional aid to state and localities, and I think there's a strong policy rationale for doing that, I think it would be very valuable to tie the amount of that aid and the duration of that aid to economic conditions at the state level. That would help ensure that the amount of aid provided and the length of time that aid lasted for would actually match the intensity and duration of the economic distress and the fiscal pressure that states and localities are facing. So with that, I'll wrap up, but I look forward to the other presentations and I look forward to all of your questions. Thanks very much for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Fiedler. We really appreciate that. And we will, we have some questions, and it looks like I'm going to need to find a different place in my office to go. My internet's a little bit unstable. But next up, we have Dr. Eric Thompson, who will share his forecast of the state economy. And we'll turn it over to Dr. Thompson.
Okay, thank you, Renee. Pleased to be here today and like to give you the highlights of our forecast for the state economy here in Nebraska from our Nebraska Business Forecast Council, which is a collection of economists with university, state government, and some of the utilities in the state. I'm going to briefly talk about the U.S. economic outlook. That's Matt ably covered that issue, but obviously the state outlook is implicitly there's an assumption about the U.S. economy, so I thought I should let you know what that is before I talk about our state outlook, and then give you the Nebraska outlook, including some information on income growth and taxable sales growth. Just some real quick characterization of the current recession. It's directly hit a different group of industries than we typically see, and as Matt indicated, it tended the hardest hit industries tended to be somewhat lower wage on average than you'll usually see during a recession. And so that obviously has some implications for tax revenue, as Matt pointed out. In terms of what we're assuming will happen with the U.S. economy as a basis for our Nebraska forecast. So we were expecting, despite the sharp decline in the economy in March and April and perhaps the beginning of May, we were expecting a recovery to begin in late May or early June in the U.S. economy. Now, this is a year-over-year GDP decline, so we're not saying the second quarter. We're saying if you look at the whole year of 2020 and you compare that to 2019, we expect that U.S. GDP and employment will be down between 4% and 6%. Obviously, it'll be a lot more in the second quarter. So I would say this is probably in the middle or perhaps slightly more optimistic than the four forecasts that Matt presented. Those focused on unemployment rates, but I'm just translating here. We do think there'll be a good solid bounce back with most of that GDP recovered, excuse me, at the national level in 2021, and then a return to quote unquote normal growth in 2022. Employment will bounce back as well. But you see what we're saying there is there'll be a recovery, but we may not get everything back by 2021. And again, here I'm talking about a calendar year. So unfortunately, our forecast that we produce is based on calendar years. So we'll have to translate a little bit into fiscal years. Now, while, as Renee hinted at the beginning, while Nebraska's been is less hard hit by this recession for a variety of reasons. Obviously, our policy, stay-home policy, is very There's also some fun we haven't had a stay-at-home order, and we've also had just some fundamental differences in our policy that's caused us to be less hard hit than the country, although certainly we're very hard hit too. I draw an analogy to what happened in Nebraska during the Great Recession of 2007 through 2009. Our recession was not as bad as it was nationally. It was significantly less bad. However, it was still pretty bad here in Nebraska, and I think the same can be said of this recession. So why are we less hard hit? Well, first of all, a smaller share of our economy is in some of the heavily impacted sectors. So we have a lot of wonderful tourism and travel attractions here in Nebraska, but it doesn't dominate our economy as it does in some states like Nevada, Florida, parts of the Carolinas, and so forth. We're not as active in the automobile assembly, certainly, and parts and assembly industry here in Nebraska. We don't have a big oil drilling industry. That's been another really hard hit sector. So less of the hardest hit sectors. Similarly, we have more of the least hard hit sectors. So obviously agriculture has been impacted already, not saying there's no impact there, but food production and processing are necessities and have been impacted less by the current recession than a number of sectors. Demand for necessities is fairly stable. Also, we have a very large finance and insurance industry, and these are two industries where there's more potential to work at home. In industries where there's more potential to work at home, there's been less disruption due to the COVID-19 recession. So for those reasons, we don't believe Nebraska will be hit quite as hard as the nation. Now, retail trade employment and service employment. Services employment includes a lot of things, but one of the things it includes is lodging. It includes restaurants. It includes personal services like beauty shops and barber shops. So that's a very impacted industry as well. So we think those two industries will have pretty significant impacts. And here we're talking about the drop in employment all for the entire year. So the entire year of 2020 compared to the entire year of 2019. Obviously, the drops in these industries are larger right now. Now, the exception to that is manufacturing. Manufacturing is an example of an industry which, while it wasn't the hardest hit industry directly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, at least all aspects of manufacturing, we certainly had examples here in Nebraska where it was, if you think about the meat processing industry, but broadly speaking, it wasn't as hard hit directly as most industries. We are in a recession now, and so the recession is going to spread to many of the industries that usually decline during recession. So manufacturing would be one of those. So year long, there will be an employment impact on manufacturing as well. So what's the bottom line for non-farm employment? Again, these are calendar year numbers for Nebraska. We think while employment has dropped a lot more right now, it'll recover as the year goes on. And for the year as a whole, employment will be about 2.5% less in 2020 than it was in 2019. We'll get a lot of that back in 2021. Maybe the middle or the end of the year in 2021, Nebraska will be back to its pre-COVID level of employment. But for the year as a whole, we'll get most of that back, but not all of it. And then 2022 will be, I would say for Nebraska, that's a little bit stronger year in terms of employment growth as we continue to recover. A little bit different story for income. I'm going to focus on non-farm income here, which is more than 90% of Nebraska income. We're going to see a sharp decline in income in 2020, and then a strong, and these are calendar years, a strong recovery in 2021 in income from wages and benefits and salaries, proprietor income, and dividends, interest, and rent income. However, in 2020, to mitigate some of that loss in earned income, wages and salaries, and dividends, interest, and rent income, we've had a rapid increase in transfer payments. Obviously, those economic impact payments, which is the formal name for those $1,200 checks that were being sent out, and higher unemployment insurance benefits and more people receiving them, obviously. But the extra $600 in the unemployment insurance benefits as well. So that's mitigating our income loss quite a bit here in 2020. One side note, the economic impact payments, those $1,200 checks are not subject to state tax, it's my understanding. So that decline, okay, and also taxable sales. Obviously, we have declining non-farm income, as I just indicated. We also have a drop in farm income in 2020. We've also had a rotation of consumption. So people have spent less at restaurants and are spending more at on untaxed groceries. So that's going to affect our sales tax revenue as well. Automobile sales are down. I know that's partly due to an opportunity the governor provided to delay payment on some of that, but it's also just the lower sales taxes. Automobile sales are down a bit as well. Now, overall, we think because of that rotation, the taxable sales for calendar year 2020 will fall somewhat more rapidly than in the Great Recession. So here's our bottom line for some of these key indicators. Farm income will be down in 2020, but then we'll bottom out and we should get a little growth in 2020 and 21. I'm going to distinguish here between non-farm personal income and taxable non-farm income. The difference is those economic impact payments, those $1,200 checks, which are not subject to taxation. So those will mitigate the loss in non-farm personal income in 2020. We think we'll only be down about 1%. However, those will go away in calendar year 2021 and limit how much growth we have that year. You strip those out and look at taxable non-farm income, that'll fall a little more sharply, 2.4% in calendar year 2020, but then bounce back in calendar year 2021. And we think we'll see a similar pattern with the fiscal years. If you 2020 would map, calendar year 2020 would map into fiscal year 2021. Calendar year 2021 would map into fiscal year 2022. Taxable sales will fall sharply, but it'll bounce back in 2021. And you can see inflation will be very low this year. So those are the main points I wanted to make about our outlook for the Nebraska economy.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. And I failed to mention Dr. Thompson is the Carl H. Nelson Associate Professor of Economics and the Director of the Bureau of Business Research at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So thank you so much for that presentation. And now we will turn it over to Brandon Kaufman, who is the Director of Finance for the City of Lincoln. Brandon.
Thank you, and thanks for having me today. And you know, I think we've all kind of struggled through this, understanding impacts, especially at the local level. You know, we're getting more and more data that's coming in that's really helping us to analyze as we move forward. And for the City of Lincoln, we operate fiscal year starts September 1st. So, you know, we've had some great impacts on sales tax, especially from online sales tax prior in the year. But so that's kind of offsetting potentially some of the losses that we've been taking from COVID so far. See if I can get there. There we go. So early on in this, National League of Cities did a survey looking at cities as to what the potential impacts would be. You can see the ranges, especially, you know, larger cities, 70% of them. We're looking at anticipating to cut public services. So across the board, everybody was seeing major trends of potential curtails in services moving forward. In addition to that, you know, a lot of cities definitely felt there's going to be furloughs and potential for layoffs throughout. We've been working through our budget process now, and you know, it's been a struggle getting through it, especially with a reliance on sales tax to balance our local taxing funds. So really what we've been trying to do is focus on short term and look at the various revenues that could be impacted. You know, sales tax obviously is our primary concern, but we also have a number of occupation taxes that help fund revenues throughout the city. Our services, we've got guest taxes that come in, library fees, recreation fees. So there's plenty of different revenues that we're potentially impacted by COVID-19 as we curtailed certain services, or health directives really impacted certain industries. So we focused on developing multiple scenarios and really kind of looking at potentially what was the worst case for the impact, especially for sales tax during the short-term needs, just so we knew from a liquidity standpoint, what the impacts were going to be to the organization. So any entity really needs to look at doing those various scenarios, just because the impacts really vary depending on the types of revenue stream or the type of industry. And then really, making sure from a cash needs perspective that you've got adequate fund balances, and those are going to help carry you through during this short-term, hopefully, economic crisis. So like I said, these are really areas that we looked at, sales tax, occupation taxes, library fees, rec fees, significant impacts to parking downtown, significant impacts on gas tax as less people were out driving, and Keno dollars that go to help fund various library and park services, social services throughout the community. We saw significant decreases. So sales tax, so these are the actual results for March. We were down a little over 4% for March, and in April we were down about 14%. So initially our projections were pretty drastic drops. You were looking at maybe 16 and 40% for those months. So, like I told the governing body the other day, I never thought I'd say 14% drop was good news, but it was a lot better than we were forecasting, on a really conservative basis. However, as we've seen, impacts of COVID-19 have also varied by sector. So like Dr. Thompson mentioned, automobile dealers were down significantly, about 11%. But you also see building material and supplies, lawn and garden, grocery stores increase significantly versus clothing stores or beer, wine, and liquor stores increasing about 20% as well. So this is really varied by industry, and some others are doing better from a sales perspective than others. So this is just the March data that we've received so far from the state by sector for the city of Lincoln. Occupation taxes are a core revenue stream, especially for the West Haymarket JPA, where the joint public agency between the University of Nebraska and the city of Lincoln. These are our core income for occupation taxes that help pay those bonds off. You can see we've got data for April and May, and car rentals, hotels, really primarily impacted with significant drops in revenue. Also bar and restaurants, all impacted by the directive health measures in effect. We're expecting that trend to start coming back up, as the health directives went away, and we see a lot more activity in the downtown area. So we're hoping that trend continues moving forward. Of course, the problem is nobody knows at this point, what those directives might look like in the future, especially as we get into a potential second round of COVID and we continue to get more cases. You can see parking revenues, basically, as people aren't coming downtown and parking, those have dropped off significantly. As we don't have events at the arena, we don't see a lot of parking in the area either. Also, another just indicator I thought was kind of interesting, Keno revenues, these go to help fund library and park services and social services throughout the community. You can see, March 30th, we look at this on a weekly basis, almost an 80% drop in late March and early April, but that trend has been continuing to go up. So that's a positive sign that we see in the community as things start to open up. So what we've really looked at, we know we have problems on the revenue side, but also, looking at the policies and service side of areas that we can really control in the short term so we can maintain cash, controlling personnel costs, whether that be through freezing vacant positions. Some cities have done furloughs. That's a negotiable item for us, so a little bit harder to do. But also, negotiating those personnel costs moving forward to try to bring those in lower, because that's the most significant portion of most businesses. Deferring capital asset investments. We've looked at all this as we've developed the budget, deferring certain types of purchases. Refinancing debt is a great opportunity to look at right now, just because the interest rates are so low. As the feds drop the rates, the rates that we can issue debt for is a lot lower than before. That's a great opportunity right now for local entities. And then just looking at various maintenance and replacement standards to see if we can defer some of those types of assets as well and help our liquidity in the short term. We're very grateful, the federal government has provided some assistance to localities. There's, the Corona Relief Fund. Unfortunately, that's only for populations over 500,000. So I think Douglas County was the only county in the state to receive those types of funds. The Municipal Liquidity Fund is if as a municipality or state, if you're having short-term liquidity needs, the Treasury is actually loaning out short-term low-interest loans to states and local governments to try to help. I would think most local governments within the state of Nebraska, though, wouldn't need these liquidity loans. It might be more for if you were in a state where, as a local entity, you receive an income tax in April, but that was delayed until June. An opportunity to look at a low-interest loan from the Treasury might be beneficial. In addition, we're seeing that the state of Nebraska is going to look at distributions of $100 million to counties, cities, villages, and utility districts. Those uses are fairly restricted, and then we're very grateful for the help. We've had a lot of expenses in related to COVID-19, especially for protective gear and providing sanitizing equipment for buses or the arena. So there's lots of surfaces cleaning, so that's been beneficial that revenue is available. But the biggest impact for us also is really this revenue loss, and at this point we can't utilize the federal dollars for revenue replacement. So these have been really helpful for municipalities. However, hopefully if there's any future legislation helping out with revenue replacement would be very beneficial. So with that, I'll stand for any questions. COVID-19, I think the impacts have really varied depending on which state you're in. Like I was talking to a fellow finance director in Connecticut. They're primarily property tax funded. It's about 98%. And as people were going out of New York and trying to buy property in Connecticut, that's probably going to help their local economy. But really in the Midwest and the finance directors I'm talking to, we're primarily reliant on sales tax and property tax and occupation taxes. And those have been really impacted throughout this crisis so far.
All right, thank you so much, Brandon. We really appreciate that. And we are going to start some Q&A. Brandon, just two things really quick. I have one clarification, and then just we're getting a little bit of feedback on your side. So just I don't know if you've got some papers or something. Could you clarify on your slide when you talked about furloughs and layoffs? Are those national numbers?
Yes, so that was a National League of Cities survey that was put out. So. And this was early on, so they were trying to get a really impact at the local level of what cities we're going to be facing over the upcoming 3 to 4 months. I think we've seen that happen with a number of furloughs and layoffs in local governments.
Do you know, has there been much in Nebraska at this point?
I know some have, however, and I could speak to the city of Lincoln. Furloughs at this point are a negotiable item with unions. So until that item's negotiated out, that hasn't been a tool that's been utilized with the City of Lincoln.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have a number of questions, as I said. Matt, can we start with you? Can you just talk a little bit about what you're hearing about what the next, another stimulus package might look like at the federal level? What the latest is on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think to be clear, it's a very fluid situation. So I will tell you my sense of where things are right now, but I think talked about uncertainty earlier. I think there's a lot of uncertainty here. So, I do think as the enhanced unemployment benefits expire over the next several weeks, there will be a push I think that will be a sort of triggering event for another round of legislation. I would expect that to include some extension of both the duration and the size of unemployment benefits. And I would expect that to also be a vehicle for various other policies, including probably some additional assistance for states and localities. I think, frankly, how large that is and what form that is still very much up in the air. In general, the dynamics here has been the House has been very interested in additional assistance to states and localities, and the Senate majority, at least, and the White House have been very skeptical. Presumably there's some trade that happens where some amount of assistance is provided, but maybe less than the House wants. But exactly where in the middle that lands, I think it's very hard to say.
All right, great, thank you. Eric, can you just talk a little bit more? You had some slides where you showed declines in GDP growth and other things in 2020, and then you've got bounce backs in 2021. So for example, GDP you thought would largely bounce back in 2021, rising by 4 to 5% with GDP growth normalizing in 2022. So my question is, if you can just explain some of those numbers where you saw the decline and then some bounce back, is that bounce back, what year would that be relative to? And in other words, do you expect in 2021 that we recover to 2019 levels, or what does that, if you can explain that for us, what the comparison is, and how does that translate into state revenue projections by fiscal year, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure. So the recovery we're expecting in 2021 would really be just back to 2019 levels. So in terms of employment, we think 2021 employment will just be slightly less than it was in 2019. In terms of revenue, it might be slightly more due to inflation, but in real terms or in per capita terms, probably be also a little lower.
And we would expect to, you mentioned this earlier, but I just want to maybe sort of reinforce that even though a lot of income is coming into this state and some of those stimulus funds, the individual checks, for example, are not taxable, right? So,
That's right.
So 2021 income tax receipts could potentially be down.
Fiscal year 2021, yes. So as I indicated in that PowerPoint slide, while for calendar year 2020, which maps to a large degree to 2021 fiscal year income tax revenue, while non-farm income will be down 0.8%, if you strip out the $1,200 checks, which are not taxable, non-farm income, we're estimating would be down 2.3%. So a little bit more of a severe decline.
And because
and this, of course, is against a prior expectation back in February that would grow.
Right. Thank you. And would we expect to see that into 2022 with income tax revenue, right, as based on the prior year income? So could we expect to see income tax revenue down into 2022 because that's 2021?
It would bounce back like the employment. in the 2022 fiscal year. Just like the 2021 calendar year, employment is expected to rebound. But that rebound would simply take us back up around where we were at 2019, according to our, or in terms of fiscal years, 2019, 2000, yes.
Great, thank you. Brandon, could you tell us, it's not clear at this point what the Huskers sports games, whether they're going to be playing or playing a limited schedule with fewer people in the stadium. Have you done any scenario planning around what this looks like if any of the Husker sports are reined in a bit, and how that would impact Lincoln's revenue?
Sure, I think, you know, unfortunately, like the forecasting right now, we inevitably know we're going to be wrong. And we started in this process trying to be very conservative with forecasting, and we've got a budget that's set up off of a conservative forecast right now. And then we know those numbers have come in a little better. But the problem is we don't know what's going to happen moving forward, especially is Husker football going to happen? What is it going to look like? And then are we going to have big events in the short term? You know, down at Pinnacle Bank Arena, which really helps to drive sales down in that area. So there's just so many unknowns at this point, but I think we put out a conservative estimates in our budget so that moving forward, we're being very cautious, I guess, with our sales tax revenues that might come in, our occupation taxes revenues, so that we don't have to continue cutting services at the local level. So hopefully we're at a worst case scenario at this point, and we know maybe, you know, it's a 2-3 year recovery on sales tax window for moving forward.
And while I have you, we had a question about property taxes. Are you expecting any property tax declines?
You know, that's a big unknown right now, especially with the way that the market's behaving in property. It looks like with a limited supply, I think in a lot of areas, prices have increased in the short term because of the limited supply in the market. So what that means when the assessor goes out moving forward, if they're looking at home sales and trying to stay within the market range, I don't know if we're going to see a short-term decrease in property valuations, but maybe a little bit longer term, out maybe in 2 years from now, maybe we'll see some property tax decreases there.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see. Matt, could you talk a little bit? There was a question for Brandon, but I think maybe this is a better question for you. Can you talk about why the CARES Act funding can't be used for replacement for revenue?
Yeah, so this was just, this was a provision that was included in the CARES Act that said essentially that CARES Act funds cannot be used for activities that were included in the state's budget prior to enactment of the CARES Act, basically. And so what that meant is that the state may have lost a revenue, but if it had budgeted for spending this amount of money before it lost the revenue, it can't use those funds. It can't use those funds to fill the revenue hole that's going to keep it from paying for the previously budgeted expense. In terms of where did that come from, that was, again, a sort of outcome of negotiations between both houses of Congress and the White House. The White House and Senate leadership were very concerned about these funds being used to fill general budget shortfalls, and there are sort of a variety of reasons for that. And so to provide these relief funds to states and localities, their price was to limit those funds to only to be used for sort of direct new costs that states and localities were incurring because of COVID-19.
Even though states and localities are losing revenue because of COVID,
yep.
Still not allowed.
Yeah, it was just a political bargain.
Great, thank you. This would be a question, I think, for Matt and Eric. And that question is, you know, as states have reopened, a lot of states are seeing surges in cases and are pulling back. And I'm wondering if either of your forecasts would change if we saw a similar surge and then a pullback in Nebraska.
Yes, our forecast had assumed that we would avoid resurgence of cases back to where they were at the peak levels we saw in Nebraska. So if that should occur, obviously that's going to, for some consumers, that's going to raise their reluctance level further back, and we would expect we would see a slower recovery. So hopefully Nebraska is going to avoid the I don't know if I want to say the word mistakes, but phenomenon that occurred in Texas and Florida, where they allowed the COVID cases to spiral up the way they have.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think that's right. I mean, I think the economic outlook fundamentally depends on the public health outlook. And so how successful we are in managing the public health situation going forward will depend on, will determine how the economy performs and where state budgets are. And I think the one thing just to mention is there's been, I think, some discussion that a lot of the economic impact was really directly about, you know, stay-at-home orders and other things. But I think, as Eric alluded to, a lot of the impact really was about individual decisions in the face of the risk of getting sick. So even if states, you know, don't repeat the shutdowns they did last time around, if we do have higher transmission again, I think we'll see substantial economic.
Great. Hey, Matt, question for you. And we know you have expertise in health policy as well. So you talked a little bit about the FMAP. Maybe you could just share for people what the FMAP is, what the enhanced FMAP, you mentioned that earlier. And then, so our state has passed Medicaid expansion, but it hasn't gone into effect yet. We should be enrolling folks relatively soon for a start on October 1. Can you talk a little bit, does the enhanced FMAP then, will that support that Medicaid expansion population? Is that separate? And maybe you could speak to that for us.
Yeah, so the FMAP is just the share of states' total Medicaid costs that are borne by the federal government. And I actually should know, but don't know what Nebraska's base FMAP is. But what the Families First Act said is that whatever a state's base federal percentage was, that increases by 6.2 percentage points for as long as the federal public health emergency remains in effect. We don't know, to be clear, we don't know exactly how long that'll be, but I think it's a safe bet that'll continue for the foreseeable future. The enhanced Medicaid matching rate that applies under the Families First Act does not actually apply to Medicaid expansion. So there have been discussions in an additional round of state fiscal relief whether the scope of that bonus matching rate might be expanded to apply to Medicaid expansion, or whether there might be an increase in the base amount to reflect the fact that it doesn't apply to Medicaid expansion. But, you know, regardless, certainly these funds, these Medicaid funds, can be used to support a state's cost under expansion. I do think the other, you know, dimension we're thinking about in this context is obviously expansion is going to bring 90 cents on the dollar into a state for each dollar it spends on expansion. And, you know, particularly in the present environment, the sort of positive impression of positive effect of those additional dollars on demand for goods and services is potentially pretty valuable from a state perspective.
Great, thank you. Trying to navigate, we have a lot of questions. I wonder if anyone could, Brandon spoke to housing, specifically in Lincoln and property taxes. Matt and Eric, are you, the question was about the housing market as a state economy, whether it's this downturn. Just wondering if you have any other observations on a state or national level, or experience with the Great Recession and what happened there?
Yeah, well, of course, the Great Recession was partly an effect of a housing market bubble, so that probably, I don't know if I draw that comparison. I think the distinction I'd make is sales and income taxes are impacted by what's going on in the economy right now. The value of property reflects expectations about the economy over the next few decades. You know, now a little bit more than 5 and 10 years from now, but all of it matters. And so if we didn't see any effect in property values, or we didn't see as large an effect, I wouldn't be surprised.
And I would agree with that. I mean, I think general experience is that property tax revenues are far, far less cyclical than sales tax revenues, or particularly income tax revenues. And so while there could be some effect down the road, I think the big hits are going to be on the other revenue sources.
All right. And then I think one just final question. Can you just really quickly, as we're wrapping up, what are for each of you, what is the biggest fiscal challenge that you would expect for national, state, and local? If you can do that in 30 seconds or less each. Matt, you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, so I mean, I think from my perspective, the big challenge is how to cope with the just deep uncertainty about what the actual economic outlook looks like. That I think the federal policymakers have taken the approach so far of providing time-limited assistance, and I think there's a very good chance that any time-limited assistance will end before the economy has actually gotten it back to where we need it to be. So figuring out both on a sort of policy design level and on a political level how we make sure that assistance actually does continue as long as economic hardship continues, I think is sort of the fundamental challenge.
Thank you. Eric?
I suppose at the national level, I'm most concerned about the hardest hit states and areas.
What about on the state level? So
well,
sorry.
In other words, will they get some level of support so they have some possibility of getting through this period without massive disruptions? In terms of our state, I just hope that we can, as we did during the Great Recession, come to a consensus with shared sacrifice and pull through it as we did 11, 12 years ago.
Thanks. Brandon?
I think at the local level, it's really going to impact us from the revenue sources. So, the biggest challenge we have really is, what are the key services that we need to provide moving forward? And because really, what we provide at the local level is, police and fire, EMS, library services and parks, a lot of the quality of life. So how do we continue to provide those at the level that citizens desire, especially in the city of Lincoln?
Great. All right, well, we did not get to all of our questions for our panelists. We will try to, if you asked a question that wasn't answered, we will circle back with our panelists and see if we can get a response out to you. So I apologize for that. And I really want to thank our presenters so much for taking time to talk with us today. Thank you so much to everyone who attended. And as we said earlier, we will be sharing slides and we'll be sharing the recording. Also, we have a couple of July webinars that we hope you join us for. On July 7th at 10 o'clock, we'll be joined by UNL tax law professor Adam Timish, who will be discussing the CARES Act tax changes and the implications on state revenue. On July 23rd at noon, we'll have Appropriations Chair Senator John Stinner, and Forecasting Board member former Senator John Keane will discuss the state's revised revenue forecast. Forecasting Board is that day at 10, and the webinar will be at noon. So we'll have numbers hot off the press to discuss at that time. Thank you so much, everyone, and the Open Sky team hopes that you all and your families are in good health, and we look forward to connecting soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.